Raised in a Christian household, more than likely you were taught this story from a young age. So if you're familiar with it, it goes about that Jehovah saw that there was wickedness on the earth, and he felt that there was only badness. And so he decided to cleanse the earth. And he had Noah build an ark along with his family. And this ark was to house animals. And during the time that Noah was building this massive ship, he would also be preaching. He would be going forward and trying to tell others about what Jehovah wanted and trying to warn them of the coming flood. And of course, we know the story ends with no one listening to Noah's warnings. And instead, in fact, only Noah and his family and the animals that they brought on the ship survived the global flood. Now, when we teach this story to children, or when we think about the moral lessons that we attach to this story, what typically comes to mind? Well, generally speaking, we tell them about how Noah was described as having walked with God, having been Jehovah's friend. We tell them about how he persevered despite the opposition that he faced in the wicked world that he lived in, how he continued to preach courageously despite the things that he faced in the world around him. And this is an important lesson. It's something that, from a young age, regardless of your religious beliefs, teaching somebody to persevere despite opposition is a valuable thing to learn. But what about us today? Is the account of the flood anything more than a myth, a legend, or a parable that we teach young children? Does it have real, tangible value to us as adults and as Christians today? Well, that's what we're going to be discussing. But in order to discuss this, there's one aspect we need to address. I mentioned earlier the question, is it a myth? Many people today believe that the flood of Noah's day never really happened, that it was nothing more than a story. So, can we prove that this happened? Is there any reasonable doubt in the flood? Well, obviously, as Christians, the Bible is our authority, and so we view that first and foremost as the truth and the logical reasoning that we have for believing in the flood. And in fact, in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, and in other chapters and verses, we have specific details that actually show us exact events, dates, months, and years. In Genesis 7:11, it describes the year that the flood started, the day and the month that this took place. In other chapters and verses, it describes specific mountains, specific areas that the flood would have come to rest upon, and when the flood began to dry up. And Jesus himself actually gave eyewitness testimony of this flood. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 37 through 39, he describes the days of Noah. Now, at this point, Jesus wouldn't have been on his earthly ministry. He would have been a spirit creature. Proverbs chapter 30 describes him as being a master worker. So he would have been with Jehovah in heaven, but he would have watched all of these things take place. And there in that verse, he describes the mentality of people in that day, how they would be apathetic, how they would be more concerned with eating and drinking and marrying, and that they wouldn't listen to Noah's warnings. But this is all from the scriptures. What do we have as physical evidence today that can compel us to believe this? Well, let's take a look at a few different aspects. The first being geological evidence in the flood. This flood was described as having covered the entire surface of the earth, something that today we think is unheard of. But let's do some reasoning on this first of all. So the earth currently is covered in about 71% of its surface with water, massively deep, something that we can't even fathom, the idea of getting to the bottom of the ocean. So in some way we could argue that the earth is still partially flooded. In fact, every year we find in some coastlines that the sea level actually rises by a couple of inches to a couple of feet, depending on where you live. Furthermore, in the United States, there was one particular flood that was said to have been over 2,000 feet high, traveling at 65 miles per hour and flooding over 500 cubic miles of water. This massive area would have been comparable to about the size of the island of Cuba, for comparison. So this would have been a very large landmass. And this does leave us with the distinct possibility, according to geological evidence, that the earth could have been flooded. But what else do we have? What about fossil evidence? One of the best indicators that we have to be able to figure out the way the climate used to be and the way the world used to be was by looking at fossils from the past. So what do we have? Well, what do we associate with the regions of Italy and, say, Western Europe as a whole around the English area? What animals do we consider? Generally speaking, when we think of the wildlife in those areas, we think of something similar to that of the United States. So perhaps small deer, dogs, raccoons, possums, more traditional animals that as Americans we're very familiar with. But in fact, we have fossil evidence that shows us that at one point there were actually fossils of giant elephants and mammoths. In some regions of Italy around Rome, there were hippopotamuses, big cats, and rhinoceroses found. Now, at one time there was the theory that these animals were brought over in small numbers by a Roman general. but the sheer number of fossils that were found in this region indicate that these animals must have been native or that a flood must have brought their fossils over. In one region, there were over 20 tons of fossils excavated within the first 6 months that the site was discovered. And they continue to keep digging and find more and more every year. So what does this indicate to us? Again, either at one point there was a massive extinction event of the local wildlife that were already native to this region, or something would have taken place that would have brought these fossils over. And finally, let's talk about flood legends. Every religion, every region in the world, or almost every region in the world, has a version of a flood legend. So the one we have is from the Bible, but in fact, in many areas, including the European Celts, the African Pygmies, China, India, Lithuania, Mexico, Micronesia, and New Zealand and North America, all have their own version of the flood account. It would have been very difficult for individuals from, say, India to go all the way to North America or New Zealand just to pass a story, to learn a different language, to explain this one particular passage. It seems like it would be too difficult to be just a coincidence. Furthermore, the core narrative of this story remains the same in all of these regions. Now, it does vary, small details will change. But typically the narrative goes as follows. God was angered by mankind's wickedness. He brought a great flood. Mankind as a whole was destroyed. A few righteous ones, however, were preserved. These built a vessel in which humans and animals were saved, and in time birds were sent out to search for dry land. Finally, the vessel came to rest upon a mountain, and upon disembarking, the survivors offered a sacrifice. So what do these points tell us? The geological evidence that shows that the earth very well could have been flooded in such a capacity. The flood legends that we see prevalent around the world, and the fossil evidence that we see that shows that the world was much more biodiverse than it currently is. This gives us confidence that it was a distinct possibility that the earth could have been flooded. But why did we spend so much time trying to prove this? What was the point in discussing all of this? Turn with me to Matthew chapter 24, verse 37. And we'll be referencing in this area in the Bible a couple of times, so if you want to, you can bookmark that page. Matthew chapter 24, verse 37. It says, "For just as the days of Noah were, so the presence of the Son of Man will be." In this verse, Jesus compared the days of Noah to the presence of the Son of Man. So the last days would be indicated by the similarities and the parallels between the two. So do we see a condition today that reflects that of the days of Noah? Well, going down further to verse 38 and 39, we mentioned this earlier, Noah describes the earth as the following, or Jesus describes the earth as the following in Noah's time. They were eating and drinking, marrying and women being given in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark. And they took no note until the flood came and swept them all away. So the presence of the Son of Man will be. So what does this tell us? People were apathetic. They were distracted. They were more concerned with living their daily lives, with marrying, with eating and drinking, right, being joyful or pursuing their own personal interest, than they were with actually listening to Jehovah's direction. Is this something that we find familiar in the day and in the world that we live in today? Do we find that people are more concerned with following Bible truth, with doing the right thing and having this moral lifestyle, or are they more concerned with where they're going to go for vacation, what work they're going to be doing, and how they're going to fulfill their own happiness? 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3 and 4 mirrors this mentality, and it's something that we see today very commonly. 2 Peter chapter 3, 4, it talks about ridiculers and how they would look at individuals preaching Jehovah's message, saying, "Where is this promised presence of his? Why, from the day our forefathers fell asleep in death, all things are continuing exactly as they were from creation's beginning." Yes, even when we do point out the horrible things that we see in today, the condition of the world around us, many people today would argue, well, that's the way it's always been. That's how my grandfather lived. In fact, if anything, some people argue that the world used to be worse than it is now. What about the demonic influence of Noah's day? Now, in Noah's time, the angels came down from heaven and had sexual relations with human women. The demons were very influential at this time. Not only were they able to seduce these human women, but they also created offspring of their own. And these offspring were known as men of fame, right? They were praised. They were known as very strong, despite their brutality. In our day, we have a similar demonic influence. We find a fascination in pop culture with occultism, with spiritism, with demonism. We think about, if you were to ask somebody what their favorite horror movie most common answer, and even if it wasn't a horror movie, the most common answers you're going to find, the ones that are considered legendary, are movies like Poltergeist, movies like The Exorcist, that were so horrifying and shocking and so focused on this demonism that it caught the world's attention and today is known as a classic film. Even modern television, modern movies, books, all have, typically we find, a focus on the occult and on spiritism. And in fact, even culturally, we discussed earlier Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. We find that many individuals today celebrate festivals of the dead. So if we're in the United States, we're familiar with Halloween, and we're familiar with Dia de los Muertos. And these holidays both just so happen to land right around the same time that, according to the ancient calendar, the flood would have started. The flood would have started on November 1st. Halloween takes place on October 31st. It seems to be a very close coincidence. What about sexual depravity? We discussed the Nephilim briefly, and we mentioned how these individuals were born of a perversion of Jehovah's original intention. And, these individuals were glorified. This was commonplace. And it encouraged others around them to live a similar lifestyle, not to live in a moral way, but in a sexually depraved way. What about today? What do we see in the world around us? Well, Romans chapter 1, verse 26 and 27, if you'll turn with me. Romans chapter 1, verse 26 and 27 says, "That is why God gave them over to disgraceful sexual passion," meaning that he let them live as they wanted to live. He let them do their own choices. "For their females changed the natural use of themselves into one contrary to nature. Likewise also the males left the natural use of the female and became violently inflamed in their lust toward one another. Males with males, working what is obscene, and receiving in them the full penalty, which was due for their error." This verse describes a similar condition to the state we see today, and it parallels Noah's day. We find today that pornography, premarital sex, adultery, and homosexuality are commonplace. How often do we hear of individuals that attempt to normalize viewing pornography as a healthy way of life, or homosexuality being celebrated? Of course, we're all very familiar with Gay Pride Day, and many individuals today, whether they be celebrities or individuals in small areas, are encouraged to embrace this, encouraged to celebrate it publicly. One statistic, according to the Health Testing Centers in 2021, polled about 441 individuals and reported that a little over 46% of respondents in a monogamous relationship said that they had had affairs. Now, yes, this was a relatively small sample size, but that is a very significant chunk of individuals who openly said that they were willing to cheat on their mate, to commit adultery. And what about widespread violence? This is perhaps the one point that we need to spend the least time on, because it really doesn't take any time to recognize the commonplace violence that we see today. Whether it be reports of assault and battery, such as the racially motivated attacks on Asian individuals during the pandemic. We hear of reports of police violence where even those that we choose to protect us attack us and threaten some individuals' daily lives and safety. Today, the world around us, the news media features headlines of violence almost daily. We need to say almost nothing of mass shootings that hit very close to home, with that such as the one in Uvalde or the recent shooting of a Kingdom Hall in Hamburg, Germany. These things are commonplace. We hear them every day. We wake up, we turn on the news, we listen to it on the radio, and we hear of other acts of violence that are across not only the United States, but all over the world. And this same violence is glorified in media, in music, in games, that have you either celebrate the hero who commits violent acts, murders and fights and hurts people, or perhaps in a movie we root for the hero as he goes after the villain who does similar tactics. According to a 2021 survey by the according to the Gun Violence Archive, recorded in 647 mass shootings in the United States in 2022. More than 44,000 people died due to gun violence overall in 2022, according to the archive. How many people were victims of violent crime this year? How many more people are going to continue to suffer in the condition of the world today? But what about our promise? This is all very bleak, it's very negative, and it leaves us with a bad taste in our mouth. But will Jehovah do anything to respond to the wickedness on the earth today in the same way that he did with Noah's day? We'll turn to 2 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 5. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 5. It says, For they deliberately ignore this fact, that long ago there were heavens and an earth, standing firmly out of water, and in the midst of water by the word of God. And that by those means the world of that time suffered destruction when it was flooded by water. So here this verse describes what happened in Noah's day. And it says in verse 7, But by the same word the heavens and the earth that now exist are reserved for fire, and are being kept until the day of judgment and of destruction of the ungodly people. So Jehovah promises that the ungodly people would be judged, that they would be destroyed, that the individuals that practice and embody demonism, that are apathetic to the world's condition, that are sexually depraved and that are violent in committing these awful acts would be judged and done away with. And in fact, in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 13, if you'll turn with me there, it says, There are new heavens and a new earth that we are awaiting according to his promise, and in these righteousness is to dwell. So not only will Jehovah do away with the wicked, but he intends to save those that are righteous. So this raises the question, how do we keep our lives? How do we save our lives and imitate Noah's faith? Turn to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7. Hebrews 11, verse 7, it says, By faith Noah, after receiving divine warning of things not yet seen, showed godly fear and constructed an ark for the saving of his household. And through this faith he condemned the world, and he became an heir of righteousness that results from faith. Noah was described as being a preacher of righteousness. So the first point that we want to imitate is just as Noah had to continue preaching despite the opposition that he faced, despite perhaps the threat to his safety or the way that it would have made him feel, the stress that he would have been under, Noah continued to preach zealously about the truth. He continued to warn individuals of the coming flood. We too want to be engaged in these actions. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 11 talks about being involved in holy acts of conduct and deeds of godly devotion. And so the same way that Noah was actively involved in the preaching work and in warning these individuals, we want to be involved in these holy acts of conduct and deeds of godly devotion as much as we can be. We all have limitations. Noah likely had limitations as he was starting to get much older by the time the ark was actually built. But we want to be active in this work. We want to warn these individuals and give others the opportunity to learn about Jehovah. And this involves not being preoccupied with personal pursuits. We described how the world can become apathetic, how many individuals don't recognize a spiritual need or how they mock a spiritual need. It's easy in the world that we live in to be distracted by the need for money, and in some cases to be overcome by the desire for nice things. We obviously all want nice things for ourselves, for our family. We want to be comfortable, we want to be happy, and the world around us tends to make it look like the only way to get that is by making money, or the only way to get that is by being famous. But we don't want to be overcome by these things. We don't want to be preoccupied with work or with higher education and personal pursuits. Another aspect of this, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, it says that Noah was a righteous man. He proved himself faultless among his contemporaries and walked with the true God. So, do we walk with Jehovah? Do we prove ourselves righteous among our contemporaries? In the world we live in today, many people have lax morals. As we discussed earlier, there's this demonic influence in media, there's sexual depravity. Do we imitate their example, or do we reject that example? Do we show that among these individuals that we're going to continue to follow Jehovah's law above all else? And this can be difficult. It requires courage. Noah was likely afraid sometimes when he was out doing the preaching work, when he was so clearly different from the individuals of the world around him, especially with the commonplace violence that was celebrated in his area. He was probably afraid to go out door to door to talk to his neighbors, to perhaps be ridiculed by friends and family members. But Jehovah was courageous, and he continued to persevere. He continued to work forward and to preach the word about Jehovah. We want to ask ourselves, does my conduct silently condemn the behavior of the world? 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3 and 4 talks about how individuals were before they came to know Jehovah. It talks about brazen conduct, unbridled passions, over drinking, wild parties, drinking bouts, and lawless idolatries. These things, again, are commonplace. They're celebrated. They're encouraged even, right? Many individuals are told, well, when you're in your 20s, what are you going to do? Now's the time to make mistakes. Now's the time to go out drinking, to be involved in wild parties. But we want to reject that mentality and focus on Jehovah's direction. And this raises the question, how did Noah maintain such faith? How did he build his faith despite this environment? Genesis chapter 6, verse 13 says that God told Noah, I have decided to put an end to all flesh because the earth is full of violence on account of them, and I am bringing them to ruin together with the earth. Jehovah told Noah what the plan was for the earth. He gave him encouragement. He told him that what he was planning on doing, and all he asked of Noah was for Noah to follow his direction. Noah cultivated this faith by listening to Jehovah, by focusing on the message that he had been given. And likely he had looked at previous prophecies earlier in Genesis that we can read that show that Jehovah would do away with wickedness on the earth. So what is the purpose of the flood account for us? And how do we imitate this example? How does this relate to us? Jehovah inspired Moses to record the flood account for our benefit, so that we can gain courage, and so that we can see the relation from Noah's day to our day. The account likely strengthened Moses as he began to write this passage, and as he continued to face challenges later in life, he probably reflected on this because of the similar challenges that Moses would have faced. We want to read and meditate on the inspired Bible account to strengthen our faith. So we can go back, not only for children, but for adults, to go back and reread this passage, to relearn the story, see what we can glean from it. Perhaps one day, one part of this verse might encourage us, and another day, something else might, something that we're facing, a particular challenge or struggle. This account is not only a call to action for us, but it's a reminder that Jehovah will deliver us from a world full of wickedness. Remember that Noah was surrounded by this apathetic and aggressive, violent, and perverted world. Noah had to continue working, preaching, and following Jehovah's direction despite all of this opposition, which took courage, and it took a lot of perseverance. And so similarly for us today, we might find ourselves in a similar challenge. Perhaps we have unbelieving family members, or maybe it's with friends or coworkers that we feel challenge our faith. If you're young, perhaps it is in school that you feel that classmates or teachers challenge your faith. You might watch the news and become discouraged. Well, whatever the case is, we want to remember that Jehovah promises, just as he did to Noah, that he promises to us today that we will be saved. And he promises to fulfill his initial promise in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, to be fruitful and become many and fill the earth. And so Jehovah will do away with the wicked.